afternoon. I'm Professor McCloud, and I direct the Islamic World Studies program here at DePaul. Let me first say a bit about the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology, established here at DePaul in 2008. It's a leading center of interdisciplinary research addressing the dramatic demographic shift in Catholicism. And each April, the center hosts World Catholicism, celebrating the globally interdependent dimensions of the Catholic experience of faith at DePaul and around the world. And as a part of that, those who run World Catholicism have asked us in Islamic Studies to participate with them in World Catholicism. The topic chosen is the fiction of interfaith dialogue, a critical look at shallow encounters. Here with me today is Trent Carl, who is a 2011 graduate, and he's currently the program assistant in DePaul's Islamic World Studies program. He's engaged in, first when he's not working, so yeah, he's engaged in personal development and critique, and he's working on several social reform projects. Peter Dziedzic, all the way at the end over there, a Catholic student majoring in religious studies and minoring in Islamic World Studies, has been involved in several interfaith initiatives at DePaul and elsewhere. Part of the Vincent Louise House intentional community, he is passionate about critiquing popular approaches to interfaith dialogue and reforming the Catholic Church's interfaith engagement efforts. Richard Reinhardt in the center is my research assistant, and he has been involved in various models of interfaith engagement, including formal dialogue since 2001. He transitioned from Protestant faith to the Catholic Church in 2002 and has been involved in community service, advocacy, and organizing since that time. For the past 5 years, he has lived in intentional community, first as a Catholic worker and now a Capuchin Franciscan. We will engage you in a number of different ways. We have some wonderfully engaging video clips. And then at the end, I think we're going to rearrange ourselves a little bit to have some intentional dialogue. Let me first start off with Richard.
Yeah, actually I just wanted to say a few words about how this presentation came to be. Trent and Peter and some others and myself had started talking about models of dialogue, especially, and how power plays out in those models in ways that were sometimes uncomfortable for us. Yet we were all also constantly engaged in some process of informal interfaith conversation. And I think felt like we all benefited from that. So I just want to say some words about where this came from. We hope that this can kind of be a more informal space, perhaps, despite the setup. And we really want to expand this conversation into a conversation with you all. Not so much an interfaith dialogue in itself, but rather, what are the assumptions we bring to dialogue? What is the purpose of dialogue? So to really problematize and begin to try to scrutinize the need for dialogue, what it is that we're doing, and why we might do it or not. And with that, I think we have some video clips to start. What's that? Yeah, and in the title, The Fiction of Interreligious Dialogue, and there's kind of maybe a question mark hanging over that. We want to explore conceptions of dialogue, why people seem to always think it's important, but also play to bring in some depictions of dialogue, perhaps in film or even in popular comedy. And we're going to start with some comedy. So.
Hello, newcomers, welcome. Can everybody hear me? Hello? Can everybody? Okay. I am the health director. It looks like we have about 8,615 of you newbies today. And for those of you who are a little confused, you are dead, and this is hell. So abandon all hope and yada, yada, yada. We're now going to start the orientation process, which will last about, hey, wait a minute, I shouldn't be here. I was a totally strict and devout Protestant. I thought we went to heaven. Yes, well, I'm afraid you were wrong. I was a practicing Jehovah's Witness. You picked the wrong religion as well. Well, who was right? Who gets into heaven? I'm afraid it was the Mormons. Yes, the Mormons were the correct answer.
Let me see if I understand this. You're concerned that he isn't concerned that you're going to hell, and you feel that she's too bossy.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, oftentimes in cases of interfaith marriages, couples have different...
Whoa. No one's getting married here.
You aren't? No. Oh.
We're just, having a good time.
Oh. Well, then it's simple. You're both going to heaven. Oh boy, this is bogus, man.
Well, thank you, Father.
Oh, did you hear the one about the new guy in hell who's talking to the devil by the coffee machine? Really not going to hell.
Lighten up. It'll only feel like an eternity. Jerry, there's this...
So, I wanted to start with those because I think both of these show that interfaith dialogue is something that's always going on. Like, we live in a pluralistic society. Engagement with people who identify as members of other faiths is always part of our existence, our journey. And I think both of these point that out really well. My presentation is going to focus a little bit more on a top-down approach, talking about like the history of Catholic teaching around this issue. And I hope what that's going to do is give us a bit of a backdrop to engage these questions of how we relate to one another on the ground. Okay, so I wanted to start with some questions to kind of frame what my presentation is going to be about. So these are things you might have kind of in the backdrop of your mind as I'm giving a little bit more history of the Catholic approaches toward interfaith dialogue. What should be the goals of interfaith dialogue? Why does religion become the topic of interfaith dialogue? And by that I mean, why does interfaith dialogue become a thing that we do? Why isn't it anything else? I mean, one could talk about interracial dialogue or something like that. Why is faith what we hone in on? What are some of the different attitudes, methods, and approaches that facilitate the dialogue? Also, with that question, we can think about what might be some approaches or methods we look at that actually tend to hinder the dialogue and obscure real human communication from taking place. And this really frames what I'm about to get into. What can we take from the Catholic institutional response to the above questions or not? So these are just some definitions that I wanted to give that I will have operative as I'm speaking. Leonardo Boff defines religion as what joins together, and Ramon Panacard talks about it as a relinking of things. And the reason this is important is because religion is a somewhat contested term. Can we talk about Hinduism or Islam as a religion using this proper 19th century definition? I don't know if we can or not. But when I use the word religion, I'm talking about this sense of a cosmology that holds one's world together and is operative. Dialogue, of course, literally through speech. And then Panacard's dialogical dialogue is the conversation that cuts through both intellectual concepts and emotional projections. It meets the religious other as a person. Whether or not this is a goal that can be truly achieved might be a different question. But I think that as far as setting the stage, Panacard's definition gives us a place from which to begin to work. As I said, most of what I'm about to share will be a top-down, kind of normative history from the Catholic side of things. And this is important because what I'm about to share, I think in the broader realm of interfaith dialogue, is often assumed to be the platform from which things start. The problem with this is that if you're coming from a Muslim background or a Jewish background or something like that, those same frames might not be there to speak, so we can't assume them. If you have any questions, especially questions of clarification, please interrupt me. Please raise your hand, and I want this to be more of a dialogical thing about dialogue than just me talking. So what I'm going to share, because of time, is just a few moments that are seen as significant from the Catholic side. So Nostra Aetate and the Second Vatican Council is, of course, an incredibly important moment for what we call interfaith dialogue. We know that interfaith engagement is something that's always been happening to some extent on the ground among people in their daily lives. But from the Catholic side of things, we tend to really look toward the Second Vatican Council and Nostra Aetate as something that institutionalized the legitimacy of dialogue, right? So John the 23rd was elected as Pope. He had had experiences of helping Jews in the Holocaust in Turkey. He took a sympathetic position toward an engagement with the world. And he thought that the church should be in conversation with the world. When he was elected, it was thought that he would just be there for a few years and then retire, die, or something like that. But he ended up inaugurating and convening this council that really changed a lot. And dialogue was, of course, a huge part of that. That's a picture from the council where there were bishops from all over the world, bishops from the Eastern Catholic Church, and Orthodox leaders, some Protestant leaders were invited as observers. And this is Cardinal Augustin Bay, who is also a leader of this interfaith initiative at the council, meeting with American Jews. Rabbi Heschel is in the center, who's of course a significant figure. So I want to talk about this idea that the council was in conversation with a lot of different groups of people, or at least trying to be. So I think Nostra Aetate is the document that really begins to work with interfaith questions. And for the interfaith movement from the Catholic side, people are always looking back to Nostra Aetate and trying to claim its legacy as that which legitimizes any exercise of interreligious dialogue from the Catholic side. I think something that's often perhaps left out of the history is a larger historical context that this was after World War II, this was after the Holocaust, and the Catholic Church, particularly in Europe and North America, felt like some recompense had to be made to Jews for the horror of the Holocaust, and that Nostra Aetate became one way to begin that conversation. Catholics felt this need to apologize for their complicity in the Holocaust. And I think that's important, but I think it's also something that kind of gets lost in most of the histories of the Council. We have other religious bodies releasing statements about this very same thing around the same time the World Council of Churches is also talking about it. Before the Council, scripture scholars who are prominent in Rome are saying this has to be something that's addressed. Like the way we treat scripture and the way we look at the text in relationship to the Jews is something that has to be rethought. There are also representational practices of Jews going on in liturgy that people are saying have to be removed because they're seeds of hatred and could have actually contributed to the Holocaust and anti-Jewish sentiment. It was also a contested document. It was something that, from the beginning of the Council in '62, people said this needs to be worked on, and they were going through draft after draft. They were facing opposition from different parties. And finally, at the last session in '65, they come up with a statement that meets almost unanimous approval. The document itself wanted to demonstrate that other religions attempted to deal with the same human questions as Catholicism. And this is a massive turn, right? Because you're not approaching it anymore from something of everyone's going to hell or something like that. But it's beginning to be approached from the perspective of other religions have legitimate things to offer. And as human beings placed on this earth next to people, we have to find a way to relate to one another in peace or something like that. So it wanted to emphasize points of unity between different traditions. And as I said before, it wanted to begin to reform and contest representational practices. And that's especially with regard to Jews. So I'm going to read a few quotes. The Church regards with esteem the Muslims. They adore the one God, living and subsisting in God's self, merciful and all-powerful, the creator of heaven and earth, who has spoken to people. They take pains to submit wholeheartedly to even God's inscrutable decrees, just as Abraham, with whom the faith of Islam takes pleasure in linking itself, submitted to God. They also acknowledge Mary, the Virgin Mother. At times they even call on her with devotion. In addition, they await the day of judgment. And then it acknowledges histories of quarrels and hostilities between Christians and Muslims, and urges people to work for mutual understanding and to promote, for the benefit of all, social justice, moral welfare, and peace and freedom. So what we see from this, I think that this one example in relationship to Islam demonstrates a turn in prior thinking, right? And so this is what we see through the document, this kind of acknowledgement of the human condition, seeing religions as trying to work with that, and trying to find ways to relate to one another. Now I'm moving on past the Council to John Paul II, and I think Peter's going to talk about this a little bit too, the Assisi gatherings where he was gathering people from different faith traditions. And a picture of the Pope venerating the Quran. So this is also a contested history though, because I think there's a question it's clear that John Paul II made interfaith relations an important part of his PR policy, if you want to call it that he was constantly moving all over the world, visiting Muslims, talking to people of other traditions in a way that wanted to reach out for peace and talk about the common good. But this history, I said, is also contested. The Vatican came out with a document close to the end of John Paul II's papacy called Dominus Jesus. And what this basically maintained was an earlier theological approach where Christ is the doorway to salvation for all, which is, of course, a huge problem for interfaith dialogue at the expert level, but also, I'd say, is a huge problem on the ground. Because if you're talking about histories of missionaries in different places, what is it about? Is it about converting people to your tradition? Or is there room for an understanding of mission as service and mission as a type of solidarity and accompaniment that isn't trying to convert people? And so what this document did that came when John Paul II was still Pope, and it's not the only document like it. I mean, this was happening at the theological level. Really could have prevented some religious dialogue in a way. I'm going to just end with two video clips. The first is from a recent film, award-winning film, of Gods and Men, and it's talking about Algeria. And what I was thinking about was this document, Dominus Jesus, talking about Christ as the only gateway, and maintaining this need for evangelization. But we can lay that up against this fictional account based on a true story of monks who were trying to cooperate and collaborate and relate with people and not have it be a thing about conversion. I strongly recommend the film. I strongly recommend the book. This trailer is not perfect, but I want to show it just to introduce you to the narrative.
L'aspect pour avoir une protection d'idées. Je pense que ce n'est pas souhaitable. Et comment voulez-vous ça? Mais qu'est-ce qu'on fait s'il vient au monastère? Se laisse tuer gentiment? C'est un risque, oui. Peut-être faut lui partir. Est-ce que ce village va grandir avec le monastère?
Si vous partez, on ne saura pas où se poser.
Les consignes deviennent très sérieuses. Vous savez bien que personne d'autre que nous peut nous décider à quitter ce pays. Rappelle-toi encore. Espère. Tout. Un monde endure. Tout. Qu'est-ce qu'on fait? Qui souhaite rester.
So what we see in this narrative, which again I recommend strongly, is this interplay between men who are very human, very imperfect, yet committed to a place and committed to knowing their neighbors and interacting with them on a real human level, not something about conversion. The reason why this is important is because I think that for Catholics it can raise some critiques toward how we conceive of mission and think about what evangelization means. and this has ramifications, of course, for dialogue. I also just want to share a quick video from Raymond Patakar, whose work, if you're interested in dialogue, I recommend you look into. He's an amazing person in many ways. I think he was fluent in 12 languages, a Catholic priest who was really working with Hinduism and with Buddhism and thinking on intellectual and philosophical levels about what methods of dialogue we can use.
One of the metaphors I use is that we are all seeing the world from our particular point of view. We see the world through a window. And here I say two things. First, the more cleaner the window is, the less I see the window and the glass. And the more I am enthused and in love with what I see. So I don't see my window. I see through the window. And I need my fellow to tell me, look here, you're looking through a window. But then I have to tell them, sorry, you also look through the window. And then we compare notes. And in great part we see the same landscape, but perhaps we see it a different way also. And perhaps then, oh no, I would like to see that, and it's all right. So we need each other. But here's another thing with the metaphor of the window. I see through my window, and I cannot say that I do not see what I see through my window. I don't see through the window of my neighbor. But if I love my neighbor, which I think is not bad, then I will have to hear the description of what my neighbor said. And they say, well, sorry, I don't see that, because I see the window. But I hear you telling me something else. Well, what do I discover? I discover two things. I discover that the other, my neighbor, doesn't see the same world as I see. But I discover that I don't see the whole world. Because unless he's a fool and I'm fanatic, or I haven't heard him, I hear. And you remember that St. Paul said that faith comes from hearing. I hear the other telling me something about the world or reality, about he or she sees through the window, that I don't. And then, well, I say, well, then the world is much nicer than I thought. I thought I was seeing the whole thing picture, and I was telling you that things a little bit. Well, I don't like more, I like better. It's an enrichment, it's a challenge. And here begins the inter-religious dialogue. You say what you hear, you say what you believe, you say your experience, and are ready at the same time to hear the other telling other narratives, other beliefs, other experiences. And then we dialogue.
So just as a way of concluding, I want to say what I've tried to do is lay out some dominant histories and some different methods and approaches that people are talking about with respect to dialogue. What I'm hoping we can begin to do is problematize how they work at the level on the ground in every day. But I thought that this kind of dominant history and things about the different methods of dialogue was important to bring as part of the backdrop to our conversation. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. As I was introduced, my name is Peter Dziedzic. I'm a student here at DePaul in my third year. And I'm going to be sort of taking a different approach from Rich, more of a bottom-up perspective. And this is because here at DePaul and elsewhere, I have been involved in a lot of interfaith initiatives, per se. I've done some work with the Interfaith Youth Corps, which is a Chicago-based NGO here in Chicago that tries to focus on interfaith cooperation among U.S. college students. I've also done work with the United Religious Initiative, which is another NGO based out in San Francisco, as well as a few organizations here at DePaul, such as DePaul Interfaith, which is the student interfaith club such organization. And I'm going to touch upon a few main ideas that I've been thinking about as I've been involved with these things, but I'm going to save some of sort of the meat of it for our conversation. I feel that all of you in the room have, just a lot to say, and I'd like to build upon that. And make this more of a constructive conversation, not so much me telling you what is, but together building some understanding. So one thing that I've noticed in all of these things I've been involved in all of these sort of formal dialogue initiatives is that there's a lack of engaging other identities besides religious identity in interfaith dialogue. In interfaith dialogue efforts, there's often only a focus on one expression of identity, the religious identity. And it's a problem because this identity often intersects, informs, and is informed by other expressions of identity, such as class, race, gender, and ethnicity. And these identities are often left out of the initial interfaith conversation. And while many interfaith efforts claim to build a space that allows for this intersection to happen along the way, it doesn't often materialize. And I believe that making more of an organic effort to bring identities together needs to be not so much of an exception, but a norm of interfaith dialogue work. I believe it is possible, and it has happened before, but it's not yet other norm for interfaith work. And as Rich alluded to earlier, an example of this is the interfaith events that happened in Assisi with John Paul II. Just looking at that as a very segmented approach to dialogue, only focusing on the question of religion and not the economy or class or gender or race. So again, this is something that I've seen, and I'd like to open up for further discussion later. The other thing that I've noticed, especially here at DePaul, when you try to advertise for an interfaith event, people don't know what that means. What does interfaith mean? And I believe this also on what we're talking about is, why does interfaith have to be something that we do? It's its own little thing. It's a formal process rather than something that's an organic part of our life. And I believe that interfaith has unfortunately become a domesticated term that carries a lot of baggage with it, and we need to ask if interfaith is now about sincere faith-based interactions rather than something else. And I'll get to that in a second. But I believe that our culture and our society has put a taboo on issues of religion, especially as it intersects with issues of human rights and politics, such as in Israel, Palestine, or the Occupy movement. And again, I want all these sort of questions to come up in our conversation. Stephen Crawford, who's a scholar from Boston University, talks about moving to Interfaith 2.0. And what does that mean? That means that in Interfaith 2.0, it's a discussion that moves from talking about the real differences we have. It's no longer about what common ground we have, but what is it that indeed makes us different. I know that interfaith dialogue is often entrenched in this sort of postmodern fear of challenging each other's truth claims, and it only focuses on trying to seek that common ground. And when people focus more on the common ground than on the real differences, it's a problem because of those critical conversations of intersecting identity and the real challenges to communities that's not come out. And I believe this is connected to the issue of resistance to intersecting identity. And again, I want to connect this back to Rich's point about why is interfaith something that we have to do? It's because we're afraid to integrate religious identity into a secularized society. Are we afraid to make it an organic part of our day because there's such a taboo? Just some ideas. And I believe I wanted to ask what has been missing in interfaith youth work. And I focus on interfaith youth work because that's the area I've been a part of for several years. And it's a problem I noticed here at DePaul and the Interfaith community here at DePaul has recognized. But it's that we struggle to bring people to events. And why is that? I think it's a very interesting thing because the religious organizations here at DePaul, the Catholic Campus Ministry, the Muslim Student Group, and the Halal Group are thriving organizations, but when you come to Interfaith, you struggle to bring people. And if you look at the university ministry here at DePaul, community service organizations are flourishing. There are hundreds of students who go through service programs and it's thriving, but when you come to Interfaith, it's now it's at a lull. And we need to seriously look at why this is happening and what is missing. Why are students not interested in this? And I think in my mind there are a few ideas. One is that again, why does Interfaith have to be something that we have to do to make it separate from an organic conversation that we could have outside of some sort of formal gathering? Also, I think that Interfaith at times, Interfaith organizations are afraid to be controversial and talk about things that students are really thinking about, such as Israel-Palestine or race relations in the U.S. Why is it that we can't trust people to engage in those conversations? So this is something I also want to open for discussion. But these are just some of the things I have been noticing as I've gone through years of interfaith youth dialogue preparation. But again, I think that it's more fruitful if we have a conversation about this than me just ranting to you. So I will transition over to Trent.
Cool, thanks, Peter. Is this one? Okay, quickly, so we can start talking about questions. I'm going to give a quick overview of the Quranic conception of dialogue. For those who may not know, Quran is the Holy Scripture.
Can't hear you well.
You can't? Is this better? Okay. I'm going to go over the Quranic conception of dialogue. The Quran is the Holy Scripture of Muslims, for those who don't know. And then I will transition into a discussion on how we frame what religion is, and how frames will vary person to person. It might vary by region, it might vary by where you come from. And then I will move to build a little bit off of what Rich and Peter said. So quickly, the Quran's method of dialogue, or dialogue in the Quran rather, is part and parcel of its message. It asks people questions. It asks the reader questions. So as an example, say, this command, say, who is it that sustains you in life, from the sky and from the earth? Or who is it that has power over hearing and sight? And who is it that brings out the living from the dead and the dead from the living? And who is it that rules and regulates all affairs? Etc. So dialogue, in contradiction to maybe CNN's or Fox News' conception of Islam, dialogue is part and parcel of the Quranic message. Ask questions, offer answers, and seek truth. So there's a goal toward dialogue and Quranic conception. There's two, Rich pointed this out to me, there's two verses in the Quran that are often used in our kind of liberal, progressive societies to try to make Islam look better. I'll read those to you and then we can think about those for our conversation. One is in 364, chapter 3, verse 64. Say, O people of the book, come to a common word between us and you, that we will worship no one but God, and that we will not ascribe any partner to him, and that we will not take each other as lords besides God. Of course, when this is used, the rest of the verse is usually left out because it's supposed to feel nice. The rest of the verse is, but if they turn away, say, be witnesses that we are Muslims, or be witnesses that we are the ones that have submitted themselves to God. So we see a selective use of verses so that we can kind of come together, sometimes in an artificial way. I know there was a big conference called the Common Word Conference between Muslims and Catholics. I'm not sure others were involved in that, but this verse was used, I believe, selectively, kind of look more PC than it maybe actually is. The other is in verse 49, chapter 13. O mankind, indeed we created you from a male and a female, and made you nations and tribes that you may identify yourselves with one another, or that you may know one another. Indeed, the noblest of you in the sight of God is the most God-weary among you. Indeed, Allah is all-knowing, all-aware. So again, this concept of, oh people, everybody in the world, I've made you different from one another, so then you have to talk with one another and figure yourselves out through knowing the other. Okay? But it's not a happy-go-lucky knowing one another. To know the other is a difficult task, right? And so sometimes you have to discard the other's ideas. Sometimes you have to discard your own ideas and find out a more correct conception of the world through the other person, which I think is what Rich's last video clip was maybe hinting at. And then the third is in 16, verse 125. Invite to the way of your Lord with wisdom and good advice, and dispute with them in a manner that is best. Indeed, your Lord knows best those who stray from his way, and he knows best those who are guided. So wrapped up in the Quranic conception of dialogue or disputation is an attempt to find the truth, is an attempt to understand the world in a proper manner, or understand the metaphysical in a proper manner. So, moving on to frames, and this should inform us about how we see frames. In the second chapter of Quran, in verse 112, Quran says, certainly whoever submits his will to God and is virtuous, he shall have his reward near his Lord, and they shall have no fear, nor shall they grieve. And commentators on the Quran have said that this shows that it's not about claiming, right? It's not about claiming to be Muslim or claiming to be virtuous. It's that those of you who are X, Y, and Z, and from the Quranic perspective, there would be certain concepts that you would have to have fulfilled, certain actions that you would have to have fulfilled. If you've done those things, then you are considered virtuous. In the West, quote unquote, especially in the Protestant conception of religion, there's a very firm grasp on, if you say, for instance, you believe in Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, you're saved. Right? What I'm trying to illustrate here is that different traditions view what we call, quote unquote, religion radically differently. Okay? So if we come and sit at a table and talk about interfaith dialogue, there will be a hegemonic conception of what religion is, and the dialogue starts from that position. But somebody who's coming in from a different angle may not understand your conception of religion in the same way that the larger group does. And so people talk past one another or talk above one another. And of course, you always have to use I statements. But the problem is that there's never an attempt to debate the assumptions of one's perspective on religion itself. So my question becomes, how do we even say interreligious dialogue? Because the term religion is piled up and strung up into that phrase, but that term may not mean the same thing to different people. Right? Quran never uses the word religion. It uses the word deen, which most people have understood in Arabic as an orientation, the way you're moving in one's life. Not something that you claim. Because, again, as religion differs, especially from the Protestant perspective, a Muslim can, as we saw in the South Park episode, a Muslim admits that he or she may go to hell. So it's not just a metaphysical concept that I've claimed and named for myself, and now I'm going to speak authoritatively on whatever it is I'm talking about. Or that I feel comfortable because I am part of X, Y, and Z religion. religion in quotes here. So what I'm trying to suggest is that I think in every religious or interreligious or interfaith dialogue, there needs to be a discussion on prerequisites for what makes something a faith. Because we know how faith is used in our society today. It's a blind faith. It's a thing you believe, a thing you think about. Maybe it's not something that you act upon or do anything about. There needs to be that discussion before you can even understand one another. Okay. And in my experiences, that has never happened. These guys can talk on their positions that are facts. So there's also, we've seen, at least I've seen in the Muslim community, Dr. McCloud, I don't know if you're coined this term, but there's this conception of the Protestantization of Muslims. Meaning they started to identify religion as a saving grace. Kind of like the Protestants. I mean, I'm not going to speak on all Protestants, but I'm using this as a foil to my argument. As many Protestants have done. So it's something I identify with, and that means I'm saved and I'm okay. And then it's also something in my closet. Religion is something in your closet. It's not something you act upon. It's not something that you bring about publicly. So that then translates into interreligious dialogue, because you talk about things like, what is your theology? You know, I can read a book to find out your theology. What is it that, what is an angel to you? You see this in a lot of interreligious dialogue. It's these abstract notions, and as Peter's bringing up, it's taboo to talk about anything concrete for some reason. It's a mere swapping of ideas. And again, this is going back to our title, The Fiction of Interreligious Dialogue, because at least from my angle, the way I'm reading the Quran, how I understand dialogue is that there's a method in which you learn truth and you learn virtuous action. So when I hear interreligious dialogue, that's what I'm thinking. But then when I go to interreligious dialogues, it's a mere swapping of ideas. Sometimes it's a way to prove your liberality or your progressive values. You feel good about yourself, because I just learned about what Hindus do on their X, Y, and Z holy day or whatever. I feel good about myself. I've broadened my worldview, I think. And I go home and I sleep. I've not done anything about it. Right? So my point is that from different angles, that whole idea of the interreligious dialogue will radically differ. And that's, I think, what Rich was getting at, was that the concept of the project of interfaith dialogue from the Catholic Church came out of the purely Catholic worldview. And it came out of the dominant, it came out from the position of power within the church itself as well. So maybe it wasn't a universal Catholic worldview. And so I think we need to start challenging what we understand of these terms so that we can actually begin to have some meaningful dialogue, and we can be truthful about what we're doing, rather than patting ourselves on the back and things like
So now we have some questions asked, and probably some more that need to be asked. Let us open the floor up to discussion. Shyness is not permitted. Sarah. No, stand up. Come over into the mic.
Do you feel, since you talked about
Hold the mic down.
you talked about the Catholic role and the interfaith dialogue. Do you see, I guess, a kind of sense of control or power over the dialogue, or where do you see that has disseminated throughout the rest of the religious organization or religious groups?
Yeah, I think as far as a sense of control, like the institution tries to set certain parameters around stuff, but the issue of control has become a problem. Like, for example, in a recent statement that was released in Rome, they talked about kind of setting modes of interreligious dialogue. And what they did was they framed the scriptural passage where St. Paul is preaching, I think in Corinth, and it's where he says, you have altars to many gods, and I'm here to talk to you about the God that you do not know, the altar to the God that I make. And so this is what's coming from Rome, and the directives for interfaith dialogue, saying this is our scriptural model. And so in that sense, like, I think the problems are very clear on the institutional level about how stuff gets controlled. I think it's a different question what people actually do on the ground, who you hang out with, who you go to work with, whatever. So there are dialogues happening all the time. I want to reiterate that. I also don't want to make it like in the Catholic Church, Rome has the kind of control over everything. I think that there are a lot of women religious, for example, nuns who have done some pretty creative things that have kind of been looked down on. So now we see Rome trying to control them, right? So those are some responses I begin to have to your question. I wonder if in the audience there are any experiences of interreligious dialogue that people want to share, not so much as a question, but just to bring the experience to the group of what that was like. So I don't know if anyone here has participated in something that they would call it religious dialogue, but if you want to talk about that, it would be great.
Hello, thank you all very much for all of your very wonderful presentations. In part, I have a response to your question that's also a question. And so in terms of thinking about interfaith or interreligious dialogue, much of what you have framed has been in the context of institutions engaging each other. I'm wondering if the frame is switched to an individual. So, for example, let's say a Black person of African American descent, who is born and raised in a Baptist church, who at a certain point in their life decides that they're going to become a Muslim. Can one use metaphors or ideas or concepts from thinking about interreligious engagement from an institutional perspective to think about what that might mean for how an individual themselves is thinking about the intersection of different faiths, religious traditions, as they are perhaps making a transition?
I think the individual level, let me just welcome young men are getting themselves together and say, in our offices over in Islamic studies, there's a continuous interreligious study. Because the people that work there, the students have decided it's a hangout, are all coming from different faiths and they're engaged in a lot of stuff, and a kind of byproduct of that is that, as one of those counterparts talked about, they're always getting views from other windows. And they do it on a very personal level. I mean, even before coming over here, for example, I ran into an article, it was an announcement on CNN, I think, or MSNBC, I'm not sure which one, that talked about these nuns who were protesting, and I think they were protesting in Russia or somewhere. And immediately, the Rome issued a warning to American. And I said, I'll be darned. And when I came into the office, I said to Richard, what's with Rome? And then we thought about it and said, well, with organized religion, at least there can be an organized protest. In Islam, there's no organization, and there's still a lot of damage done to women. The women can't get organized, so the violence in all of the levels that happens arbitrarily. Not in a concerted fashion, but from all corners. So what do women need to have to say in this conversation? And as we were moving along, one of the things we also found out, or kind of reflected upon, was the near absence of women in interreligious dialogue or relations. The men set the table, the women, like others, come, the dinnerware is set, the menu is already chosen, and you try to get on board. From the Islamic perspective, that is often the issue. Muslims have what Trent read from the Quran as an understanding. They don't have a frame for interreligious dialogue, because interreligious dialogue in its more modern sense emerges at a particular historical time. It does not involve Muslims per se. So they're coming to a table, and many for the first time learning what the Bible has to say about Jews, because they don't know the Bible. So they don't know the inner workings of the textual protest. But they're coming trying to figure out, well, I'm supposed to be here, so I have to say something nice too. So it's a lopsided, prescripted dialogue that has nothing to do with, as all three have said, what is happening on the ground where dialogue could actually perhaps occur. And I think that is at that individual level, like one of the programs. Muslims have found that when Catholics and Protestants, not often Jews, land in their countries around the world, they don't know that some of those service workers are struggling with the difference between proselytization and actual help. What they see is ongoing proselytization. We will feed you if you convert. And there builds up various kinds of resentments, but they never wind up in conversation or dialogue of any kind. There is where there could be some very helpful dialogue, but I think it perhaps is misplaced in, say, Israeli-Arab affairs. One would find out that the debates are not scriptural. So maybe the text is not where one wants to have the conversation. It's in a different space. So I think a lot of things get put into religion that maybe, religious kinds of things that don't belong there. And there's some other things that squarely belong in the center never get put there, even when individuals are dying. And now since 9/11, we have such a long list of taboos and things we can't talk about for fear of surveillance or fear of being with us or against us or all of the long list of things. Conversation has shut down.
I'll just respond directly from what I understood of your question. As somebody who transitioned from a Protestant upbringing into becoming a Muslim, I see my family struggling to understand why my religion, faith thing, whatever you want to call it, my deen, my orientation, informs so much about my practical application of life. What do you mean you have to, like, we're playing a game, what do you mean you have to go pray? What do you mean I have to stop the car to, whatever, for the fireworks or something? What do you mean I have to stop the car? Because the framework for them isn't there that religion interferes in your day-to-day, for them. I'm not saying for others it may. And for us being raised in the particular church that we went to, it was like, okay, you say grace before you eat. You go to church on Sunday, maybe youth group on Wednesday night or something. And that's the extent of religion. And like, you know, there's a few like large ethical questions or ethical boundaries that you're not supposed to do as you grow up. But transitioning to a faith that informs like a lot of things, for me, from my perspective on this, like, a lot of minute details, or what would be considered minute details, they're just like, what the heck is it? And they've had to struggle with, and I've had to struggle with like, when do I bring it up and not bring it up? So I think those frames, you can see very clearly on that personal level, I think is what you're getting at. So I struggle with that.
I can just say a few things based on what I understood of your question. I was also thinking of myself, and I was also thinking of Panakar. And I was thinking about Panakar in the sense that he said when he went to India after he studied, he said, I left Europe a Christian, I became a Hindu and a Buddhist, and all of that I never left being a Christian, somehow. And I don't know what I think about that, and I'm not sure what it means. But I do think that from what I understand about people, many people are in a constant state of flux or transition and development in their thinking. And when that is laid up against the institution, I think there are serious questions. And you can see this in someone like Panakar, is how can his experience signify an institutional language in any way? How can the authority of this institution recognize this experience? And I think it just becomes something that's very impossible. But I appreciate the way his lived experience offsets a certain kind of institutional narrative that's going on. I think the problem this raises for interreligious dialogue is that you have all these people coming into spaces saying, I am this or I am that. And this is the identity thing that you raised. And to start from that point, while it might be good enough in the institutional articulations of things, is not really something that facilitates human communication taking place. Because it's flat, and people are speaking as monoliths and not dynamic individuals that I think they are. Does that make sense? And does that respond to some of your stuff?
I just wanted to raise a question just to bounce off of that, and I would like some audience feedback. You guys are too quiet. Bouncing off what Rich just said and what Peter presented in his, what if we had something, this is Rich's idea, I'm stealing it. What if we had something called interracial dialogue or interclass dialogue? You come, you sit at a table and you say, I make $40,000 a year, and let me tell you how that informs my entire life. I am Chinese. That's not even a race, but I'm Chinese. Let me tell you, and the person listening has a bunch of ideas about what that means, and they impose it on you, and then the entire time you're trying to take those shackles off. Why is it that, I mean, to me that sounds strange. Why is it that when it comes to religion, it's entirely normal?
Yeah, I agree that's problematic. I also wanted to comment on something Peter said, of this question of why is it that there aren't people showing up to interfaith or interreligious, whatever you want to call it, dialogue. And I completely agree that there is a lack of intersectionality that deters people from coming, but also I feel like the few interfaith dialogues that I've attended, it is assumed that individuals that are identifying as the same religion are having the same experience. So whether I want it or not, in a lot of these dialogues, I end up speaking on behalf of a lot of Muslim women, even though that is not something I'm capable of doing at all. And that assumption definitely deters, I know me and a few other individuals that I know personally from attending these faith dialogues, because I know that assumption is always there somewhere.
No, and thank you for sharing that experience. And the problem with the institution of it, we segment interfaith dialogue as something that is totally separate from everything else. We have to go to a special place to do it, So just, again, challenging the framework of why does it have to be a separate entity that we pursue rather than something that happens organically in a pluralistic society. And your experience, it just, I think, echoes the fact that there is this intersection, and it's not critically addressed in these dialogues. It's in the interfaith dialogue, it's a desire to look at the religion of who you are and why you are that way because of your religion. And there's either not enough time or effort or community to talk about why you are as an individual shaped by all these other identities. So, I mean, yeah, I agree. I think it's a problem with the institution of it and more organic.
I think Peter was talking about this. When different organizations come together, usually like controversial issues come up, and I think that when you're talking about faith, like it's just bound to happen. Like it's just going to happen. Like controversial issues are going to come up, and like I guess my question is like, how do you think? Why do you think that is, and why do you think it's so hard for groups to come together and talk about controversial issues? Because I don't think it should really be a problem when you're talking about faith, but it is, and I feel like it's a big reason why groups don't come together. So what do you think could be done to like help that and I don't know, I guess overcome that? Yeah, and I mean honestly, I just like to reflect this onto the audience because I don't think I have the answers to everything, you know. So anyone would like to respond to that?
Just give this. Thanks very much to all the speakers. I think a lot of the issues you raised are well taken. My question is, this is a university. There's freedom of action here and freedom of expression and creativity. Why not start groups that deal with some of the issues you want from the grassroots up? Because most of the criticisms are about institutional definitions of what religion is and how interfaith dialogue is to take place. And you've all pointed to some of the limitations that raises. I think you're in a position of rethinking and applying some of your creative criticisms to creating something new. It is possible to begin a conversation, even if it's going to be just interfaith dialogue, by raising some of the questions that Trent, you raised. What do we mean by religion? And does it make sense to talk about religion isolated from other elements of our lives? In the case of observant Jews and observant Muslims, religion is not, as you put it, segmented out, and that would be instructive to those coming out of Christian traditions where there has been more secularization and therefore segmentation in our society, like their religion has. And likewise, if you begin from the bottom up, you could insert some of Peter's concerns about, I don't live, I can't separate my gender, my religion, my sexuality, and all of the other intersectionalities of who I am, and the same applies for all of us. And so it'd be a fabulous experiment, I think, if one began. You don't have to call it an interfaith dialogue. And Peter, your question, why doesn't it happen anywhere else? Well, anywhere else in the U.S., we're running around like crazy, doing our own things. So we create spaces for meeting people to talk about things that interest us or trouble us. And so it's simply calling a space for exploring some ideas that might include religion, but some of these other things. So I think that you are in a position, while you're still in college, certainly, to begin experimenting by creating some of these alternative spaces and dialogues.
I just want to say that I think that this little panel is the beginning of it. Because I think that I connected with Rich and Peter over time through this discussion and realizing that we have some common points of view on this, that, and the other, whatever it may be. And I don't think we approached each other as like, let me tell you, I'm a Muslim, and like, you better believe whatever it is that people do. But I think that was maybe in the back of, this is in the back of my head to see how the audience would respond to some of these things. And so if we want to create an experiment, we need some other people to create an experiment.
That's another sentence.
Thank you. I'd like to frame the concept of coming together to do interfaith work as a subversive act. Subversive act against the status quo, especially within the West and the United States. I think we have a capitalistic understanding of identity, a capitalistic understanding of dialogue, and a capitalistic understanding of community organizing, where the product, the outcome, the amount served, the amount clothed, the amount done is the determinant factor of whether it was successful or not. And I think the angst that you feel when you're doing work, and it's not yielding the amount of people you're hoping for, then that is a result of this capitalistic function. So I'd like to pose just some thoughts I have and then end with a question. Harvey Cox wrote some things about how the words faith and belief are kind of becoming synonymous in the 21st century. That we're saying, my beliefs of the monotheistic God is the same thing as that is my faith or something. But he pushes it beyond that and says that there's a real difference between faith and beliefs, and I'd like to add that to the interfaith dialogue. And the difference is that beliefs are something that you believe that are unable to be taken away from you. For example, like an idea of God or the afterlife or something like that. Whereas faith has something more to do with a confidence in or a commitment to something. So I have faith in the power of coming together. I have faith in the power of compassion or something like that. And so when we think of it this way, when we say interfaith dialogue, we're meeting for dialogue or action at the intersections of our commitments. So it's not about at the intersections of our beliefs. My monotheistic God says this, and my monotheistic God says that. We're meeting at, I have a commitment about this, rooted in my beliefs. And I have a commitment in this, the same commitment, rooted in my beliefs. But it's the commitments we're talking about. And I think that helps. And it's moving us beyond, and the reason I think it's subversive, because it moves us beyond monolithic religious identities to individuals, and helping us to systematically construct our own theologies about all these different things. And so my hope is that interfaith dialogue can move away from the how do we do this work, to the what and the why, to understand it as such a subversive act. It's an empowering act, saying that you individually, all of us, have a stake in this world and has a stake in its ultimate amelioration. And I think the same thing happened with the peace movement, the environmentalist movement, and the multicultural movements that started on college campuses, because they didn't ask, how are we going to do this, but why do we need to do this? And so I guess my question is, that would be rude. I would say, do you feel that interfaith dialogue is a subversive act, and how can we begin to empower people to think of it that way, rather than it being a politically correct action in a pluralist society like the United States?
That's not just for us, it's for everybody in the audience too.
I'll at least share my experience, kind of adding to that question, I think, and maybe trying to get a point of view. So I've done a lot of the work, like organizational work, behind a lot of the interfaith events on campus here at DePaul. And so I would definitely agree with Nick that one of the questions that we always get after our events is how many people showed up and what happened. I know personally my introduction to interfaith and my sincere interest in it came from relationships that I made with people. And I feel that now moving from the relationship aspects to the organizational aspects has been, for me personally, really difficult. And I feel like that is because, there were certain tools that I gained in order to have these types of dialogue conversations that I didn't necessarily have when I first came to DePaul. So we talk about all these complexities that people bring to the table. And again, echoing what Nick said about, the society that we grow up in, I never learned the concept of interfaith growing up in school. I went to an all-Catholic high school, and I learned a whole lot about religion, but I didn't learn about interreligious dialogue. So, and I think, you can even then go on to like public or more secularized schools, who aren't even being introduced to religion at all. So it's like, you have all these institutions that we are moving through, but none of them actually give us the tools to have these kind of conversations. So something that I feel like, especially at the university level, is in these types of classes that we're taking, if there could be some kind of tools or maybe way of understanding, I feel like it would make these types of things a whole lot easier. But because we're not given these tools, I personally, in my family, listening has always been this kind of virtue that has always been really reinforced. And I know that's like a familial thing for me. But if stuff like that was not necessarily institutionalized, but at least introduced or, brought to the table, I feel like maybe that's something, again, this is me just like throwing out experience, but yeah, so I guess that's what I've experienced. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to ask another question.
No, this is thank you so much.
So thanks.
And I think I just want to touch upon something that both Kayla and Nick have mentioned, and that's the importance of relationship building when trying to pursue this sort of reframing of interfaith. I'll speak to my experience here. Paul is I'm not a Muslim, but I have a lot of strong relationships with some students on campus, and I feel that it's not because we engaged in the formal dialogue process, but because we have hung out, we've gone to dinner, we've done class parties together, and it's because we were allowed to build relationships outside of the formal framework of let's talk about religion. So, I agree. I think that relationships are key to sort of looking at how to move forward as individuals and not as institutions when talking about this thing.
I was wondering, I came from my background from an Islamic private school, both from preschool up and high school as well. And throughout my entire student life, I've received kind of a lot of feedback about interfaith, and I've participated in interfaith groups before. But there is this kind of stigma I've noticed at least in my private schools that I've been to, that interfaith is for those people who are less sure or less secure with their own religion. So they go to these areas to explore other religions because they're feeling unsure. There's this kind of stigma that forms around that, and I feel that most of the interfaith projects that are organized at least my high school were kind of formed with this stigma in mind. So they were very, for lack of a better word, they're described by a lot of people who criticize them as being very kumbaya, just very detached. So every time something supposedly controversial would ever be discussed, the Muslim students, at least from my school, would be kind of pushing back to say, wait a minute, hold on, let's not talk about that. Let's talk about the things we can do together as a community. So my question is, do you feel that some of these organizations or some of these, at least these projects, are going to undergo some kind of critical change in structure? Because if that happens, it's going to take a lot of work on the very basic level of interaction between students who come from religious backgrounds or at least religious communities that they're firmly grounded in. Because a lot of these interfaith projects are formed with this idea in mind that maybe the students are coming in with a background that they're not very secure about their own religion. So my question is, do you see that some kind of structural change is going to take place to kind of either offset those stigmas that have already been kind of integrated, or is it going to be rebuilt kind of with an entire different idea in mind, like how Trent was mentioning about starting from what religion is, rather than, with these preconceived notions of what religion is already being brought to the table.
Okay, let's take the other two questions because we have a short amount of time and we want to get all the questions in.
And then we'll respond like this.
Because we still have a little bit of a break time outside where people can continue talking.
Hi, I'm trying to, I do have a interfaith retreat project that I've been working on, and it's actually happening next week, but I've been having trouble trying to handle it myself, trying to invite people. Interfaith for me is different from what I get here because I'm on the e-board of the Interfaith at DePaul here. And at the society, which is the Theosophical Society, we go deeply into certain questions of religion and particular concepts in order to get to the actuality behind the ideas and to not just swap ideas, but to really get at a deeper reality underlying them. And I've realized that when I come back to DePaul after volunteering every summer, that it's different. We talk about the differences, and I like that type of dialogue, not the kumbaya, as Faraz mentioned, or that the idea that all the religions are the same. To me, I think that's false. I would like any of you to talk about the different ideas that come with interfaith, such as religions are all the same, because that's not what I study. I go deeply into the histories of the traditions and the different racial aspects and things like that. So would you talk about that?
My question was just trying to kind of hit on that, how when interfaith dialogue does happen, I think I've seen it like on the ground too, like just in talking with friends and peers, that it goes a lot to comparison and beliefs, like comparison, oh, I see an angel like this, we see God as this. My question is, how does one stop from just going at it at that? How would you say to then, how do you further the conversation? How do you switch from just simple comparisons to more things? Because I mean, that's where I always get caught up, is how do you go further? How do you go more in depth? Because whenever you're confronted with it, it's always just a quick comparison. And that's what people get hung up on. How do you then switch over to more in depth? Like, what is religion? What is belief itself, rather than just comparing?
Okay, do we have any more questions that we want to say?
I'll take half a minute. Faraz, I just wanted to say I appreciated hearing your experience. I'm not sure if there are any changes in interfaith institutions on the ground, but I do think that calling something interfaith dialogue, the predicament's there. Like, I question whether changes can be made to solve the problem you mentioned. And Nick, just a couple things. Is coming together a subversive act? I'd raise the questions that you raised of why are we coming together to that. And I want to emphasize and underscore what you said about a capitalist understanding of identity. And I think that choosing religion can be like shopping. And I think that there's a lot to explore there about the capitalization and the of identity.
For me, I'll take a minute. I just want to sort of respond to Faraz and Nick and Dominique about structural changes. Interfaith, I guess, after the frameworks have been broken down, needs to be subversive. But I think that we can't do that until the taboos about talking about these things are broken down. There's a taboo to talk holistically about who we are as individuals and our identity. So we can't move forward until we start to break down some of those societal restrictions. And for Dominique, I think you raised a very interesting question that I'm interested in. Personally, I feel that I've had very limited exposure to interfaith work on American college campuses. And I'm actually very interested in how mystics from various traditions have interacted. Right now, I'm very interested in studying Thomas Merton, who's a very famous Catholic contemplative monk who had some exchanges with Muslim mystics. So I'm also very interested in those exchanges, but it also points to that there are various understandings of what interfaith means and what interfaith looks like. And again, it's breaking down some of these hegemonic barriers and frameworks that Trent alluded to earlier.
And to wrap up, Nick, I think what you're getting at is 100% on point. I mean, I think the reason, like I alluded to earlier, I started talking with Rich in particular and hanging out with him because we started questioning, I think it was around the time of Occupy movement. We started talking about what that means. And I guess as a religious people, religion informs something about our perspective. And so it just moved on from there. But it wasn't like, let me find out about your religion. It was, what do we want to do in the world? So I think you're 100% on point on that. I think the problem is most people don't think about this. Faraz and Dominique, I think both of your questions are something I see is that, particularly Dominique, the whole idea of all religions are the same. I think there's a project to make it. That's how we deal with difference. No, there's no difference. We're all the same. No controversy. Let's cover it up. Everybody hold hands and sing Kumbaya. I think that's probably maybe perhaps for us. I don't know. That might be why some people are suspicious of certain interfaith groups or whatever. Is because I do think there is a push to eliminate controversial questions. There's a push to make each other seem the same. You know, we all come from the same group. We're all this side and the other, whatever. And then you never actually get to talk. And then, Lucas, to your point, I think the problem is that people associate their religion with some sort of abstract theological concept. Instead of asking themselves, the problem is actually the way people live their religion out, or don't. They haven't taken any lesson from it. So I think religion as a concept has switched from maybe, at least in certain faiths, something that's supposed to inform how one lives and supposed to inform one's ethical values, for instance, and it has instead come to something that I have to hold on to and defend. I think that's it.
Okay, I want to thank all of you for coming, and we have a coffee break right outside, and then there is another session on spirituality and tithing that will be back here in this room at 3 o'clock. Thank you again.